So, that certainly happened. I apologise for the delay in my review for this episode as I've been a tad under the weather over recent weeks, but one good thing to come from the length of time in between this is a little perspective on this instalment, and ultimately collecting enough information from several viewings now to confidently say that this episode was both an engaging affair, but I fear right now a wasted instalment to come from Ahsoka.
Fantastic.
This episode kicks us off with a little courtroom action that shows Hera supposedly being court-martialed for her actions before, where she's continually delayed responses and ignored orders from High Command in an effort to support Ahsoka and Sabine.
You fool.
And as it would appear that she's about to be found guilty, she's protected by plot armor this time, despite heavy criticism from Senator Xiono, after Senator Leia Organa throws 3PO into the mix with a get-out-of-jail-free card that shows Xiono up and leads to Chancellor Mon Mothma asking if the New Republic should prepare for a return from Thrawn.
What are you, fucking stupid?
We then move over to Ahsoka, receiving some additional training from Anakin through old recordings when Huang informs her that the Purrgil are arriving, and as they prepare to investigate, the herd is hit by several rows of space mines, and Ahsoka chooses to eject from the Purrgil's mouth and try to navigate through it, using the Purrgil as cover until they decide to tap out.
Comedy.
Ahsoka guides their ship into the graveyard surrounding the planet after being pursued by Elsbeth's forces, and they evade the pursuers for now until Thrawn calls upon the Night Mothers for support to locate her, and they manage to do so by intercepting a forced Skype chat between Sabine and Ahsoka.
Oh, for fuck's sake!
Which leads to the chase being on again with Elsbeth's forces pushing her out of hiding down to the planet's surface, where meanwhile Ezra and Sabine have a good little catch up until Skoll and Hati track them down, and with the use of the Marauders manage to pin them down and the attack begins. And it's here where Skoll relinquishes his Padawan so she can pursue command within Thrawn's ranks, knowing that she doesn't seek what he does here. And so it's on. Sabine and Ezra are pushed into action against the Marauders while Ahsoka and Huang try to evade the forces above. And as Thrawn sends some of his forces in to test Ahsoka and the rest, our fellow not a Jedi drops down to take on Baylan and then quickly leaves him to help Ezra and Sabine, as the duo fight well but are almost overwhelmed by Marauders, Night Troopers and then Shin, until Ahsoka steps in to distract her whilst Ezra and Sabine and Anoti work to take out the rest. And they succeed in pushing them back, with Ahsoka reuniting with Ezra at the end. Now, please don't mistake my tone for being one of unhappiness. I am perfectly fine with what we got in this, but considering there's no guarantee currently of a season 2, and that Filoni's movie to tie all this up could be a while away yet, this was exactly what I didn't want this close to the end. As I said last week, and I'll continue to say again, this series post episode 5 needed to be all killer, no filler.
No, he's got a point.
And whilst the filler offered much information regarding everyone's position in this, like how the New Republic are just perpetually incompetent, and Baylan, Thrawn and Ezra got much needed screen time, I was fantasy booking something more significant happening, like maybe everyone's starting to move back to the main galaxy, and then future Mandoverse projects could start to explore the effect of Thrawn's return.
I want more. And I know I shouldn't.
Which could galvanise the forces we've accrued so far over the various shows to take on the full might of his return, which would likely leave the New Republic vulnerable enough for the First Order to wriggle its way in, after exhausting their resources on his strikes and such, but instead what we got was a Rebel-style showdown with much of the language and fight sequences pulled straight from the animated treasure.
It all makes sense now.
And while I'm grateful for such a spectacle, I think it was ill-timed, or maybe even misplaced, in a show that currently has a limited number of episodes to tell its story. Now, I don't know how Thrawn will be integrated back into the main continuity again beyond his mentions in Mando Season 3 within the Shadow Council, but I know I'm more invested to understand how his hand will grab this galaxy again in the ultimate power play, especially accompanied by the power of the Dathomiri, where you can have more of these Rebel-esque style sequences back on the other side of things. I love Filoni in his style of writing, but let's be honest, this was a rather self-indulgent moment that admittedly was rewarding for long-time fans, but it did little for the narrative currently, especially with characters like Baylan Skoll, who we don't know whether or not will be coming back due to the loss of Ray Stevenson. And I think it's fair to say that his story/character has been universally acknowledged and revered as the most compelling part to the series outside of the mystery behind why Ahsoka and Sabine's relationship fell apart, and the World Between Worlds reappearance. And I have no doubt that Filoni would have written something larger in for Skull before Rey's passing, but unless they recast him or kill off his character, I doubt we'll ever see that completed here. So part of me was hoping that from episode 6 onward, we'd push to discover what he seeks, whether it be Abeloth, the Bendu, the Mortis gods, or something else entirely. I just want to know, and I'd hope at this point that the reveal wouldn't be just another hidden Jedi temple or something so trivial or predictable given the secrecy surrounding it, but who knows?
Don't give me excuses. Give me results.
I just know that I'm going to be left highly disappointed if we don't receive any catharsis over his story, given the lengths that Balin has gone to acquire what he seeks. Otherwise though, Rey continues to be one of the highlights of the show by presenting a degree of nuance and complexity within his performance that, as I've said before, brings some of the gravitas we needed to a rather floaty edition from Star Wars that draws reference from what is still considered niche projects.
Get over it already.
And quite honestly, it's a shame to possibly never see his vision for this character completed, but here's hoping that they do justice to Skull before closing out the series in Rey's memory. As for Manus Fandi, who became actualised as our young Ezra Bridger this week, he was met with a lot of mixed reactions from the online fanbase, where many couldn't see the boy we knew, but the other side picked up on the vibes of what Taylor Gray did for the character before. And in my opinion, Iman possessed and conveyed some of the cadences from Taylor's performance of the character before, but he made it feel distinct enough that you can tell this isn't supposed to be the same Ezra we knew. He's older, wiser and hairier, but rather unsuspecting considering he was perfectly valid within his questions, yet Sabine is constantly dismissive of them and he never thinks to press her for answers. His combat style is oddly understandable given the fucker hasn't been within a galaxy's reach of a lightsaber for almost a decade, so it makes sense that he would choose the Force over a weapon, but in a moment where blaster fire is everywhere and you have a rageful young woman swinging at you with a blade that just took pieces of your hair off, I think it's time that you find a blaster.
A worthy adversary. 'Tis but a scratch. A scratch? Your arm's off. No, it isn't. Well, what's that then?
The rather banterous exchanges between Sabine and Ezra were very much pulled out of Rebels in both the wording and delivery, which made this feel more innocent in its maturity. But it helped to evoke those feelings effectively of what we Rebels fans knew from before, and for what it's worth, the choreography proves to be one of the strengths of the series, showing consideration for the limitations of live action but pushing the actors enough that it resembles the energy of their animated counterparts was a smart choice, and draws on Rosario's mention at Star Wars Celebration earlier this year about the combat sequences being testing above anything else. The fight sequences were rather fluid throughout this one, and I felt that Iman channeled his focus into the movements more than Sabine and Ahsoka here, though it's never as impressive with just force moves unless you're tearing it up a Starkiller. Kicking over to Sabine though, she worked very well with Ezra here, feeling like the pairing of old and evolved in her own combat style. Swapping between the blasters and the blade is almost a singular sword and shield maneuver that generated a swell of energy for the fight. And as I mentioned, most of her interactions with Ezra were what you'd expect, but I'm getting a little frustrated with how cagey she's being over her responses, which I have to imagine is primarily around the fear that she wouldn't be able to get him home, but I have to believe now that she'll open up with Ahsoka being around. And that relationship seems to be on the mend as well, given the pair locked eyes post-fight and the young lass appeared relieved that her master and friend came for her, despite the constant bullheadedness from before that could still compromise the galaxy as we know it if Thrawn doesn't get his way here. But I think the only simmering question now left around Sabine is what happened between her and Ahsoka to cause that separation to begin with. Like, was it the decimation of her family on Mandalore alone, or was it that she was a difficult apprentice, or a combination of shit collectively? Who knows, and honestly if Filoni doesn't care to give us an answer, then he clearly doesn't want us to know or can't be asked to think of a reason. But otherwise, I'd actually consider her arc to be complete with the series now. Much like our dear Lady Tano, who took things in her stride this week in a rather bizarre fashion, where she was just chill with the Purrgil going anywhere, thinking it would be exactly where her and Huang need to go, which Huang calls out, and quite rightly. As the Purrgil were just asked to take them there, Ahsoka couldn't offer them any coordinates and there was no indication of where they needed to be. It just so happens that they have a frequent migration path to follow that conveniently takes all parties to where they need to be, but honestly, this episode felt the most Ahsoka from the current day than we've had before.
You're goddamn right.
And a solid progression of her character from the little dour disbeliever that kicked us off at the start of the season that needed a little boot up her ass from her master once more, stands before us as a wizard reborn that appears to be almost open to training everyone now, offering her hand to Shin in the closing moments, which for a second she almost seemed to take, possibly still in need of direction herself after her master just dropped her.
You're on your own. See you, buddy.
But before this, Ahsoka got that rematch against Balin and managed to show him up by embracing the full package of her combat proficiency, where previously she was struggling to utilize one blade with focused footwork, was outdone and delivered on here, with her applying both her sabers to the fight and demonstrating the power of her mentor's teachings in her movements that managed to make Balin lose his footing, and the smile from Ahsoka at the end in response to Ezra felt sincere and comforting, like Rosario peeked through here and vicariously Filoni as well, who worked to craft these characters over the past 15 years, told us how much this moment meant, and it felt oddly cathartic.
Are you crying? Am I crying? No, I'm not crying. You're crying.
And I can't leave this without passing a mention to our cold, calculated strategist, all blue balls himself, Thrawn. The man didn't feel as prominent in this feature as he did last week, despite being used to play out this little game of chess against Ahsoka, to better understand and learn more of her formation, strategies and processes and weigh them up against Anakin's tactics from the Clone Wars, a factor of which came as a surprise to him, which came as a surprise to me, and is a writing decision I'm left a little perplexed by. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but didn't Thrawn manage to deduce that Anakin was Vader in one of his novels?
What?
And yet he couldn't put together that Ahsoka was his apprentice before viewing the inquisitorial databanks. I won't harp on this for too long, but if I'm missing something then please feel free to correct me, but my understanding at least is that Thrawn in his series of canon novels managed to piece together, or it was at least implied that he managed to figure out that Anakin was Vader, and became one of the few individuals in the galaxy that knew of Vader's real identity. So I find it hard to believe that for a mastermind like him, who would take time to study the archives, movements, deceased records, data logs and such, and come to such a firm conclusion like that and be correct over Vader, would never have stumbled across Ahsoka's name in Anakin's records as being his apprentice throughout the war. I don't know for sure if this is the case or a writing misstep in Thrawn's character, but it's rare for Thrawn to be so unprepared, and assuming that sliver of information from his series of novels is still canon, he would have studied Anakin's history, and whilst it would be a huge retcon to his past that was never mentioned in the prequel movies, it would later become a huge part of his story. So this coming as a revelation for old Blue Ball strikes me as a little odd for the type of tactician he is. One that is always watching, always thinking and always planning, but depending on whether Filoni has scrubbed out another piece of writing like he did with Kanan's origins in Order 66, and Ahsoka's writing for post-Order 66 and Tales of the Jedi remains to be seen.
Good job.
Otherwise though, Thrawn was perfectly serviceable here, but given the swell of support this character has, and the admiration he has from the fanbase for being a credible threat that is nothing more than a mind with a glare, he deserves more here, and I'm praying that they've got something incredible lined up for his character down the road. And we'll close with a passing mention to Huang, who continues to be the subtle show stealer from this, full of charisma and delivered fantastically with his lines by the joyous works of David Tennant.
Good job. Good job. Good job.
And with a likely appearance next week, will be the only character to feature in every episode next to Ahsoka, and we are better off for it. Where much like Balin brought unneeded weight for the show, Huang has brought an undeniable charm and maturity to this escapade, often being the glue keeping everything together, tied up with the necessary levity that the show needed. So here we are, closing the doors on Ahsoka from next week, and as it stands, I have much hope for this crossing the line with a win, but I have to be honest, this episode was not what I thought we'd be doing this week. I really wanted things to progress in a more refined manner that would focus on setting us up for the next chapter, whether it come in the form of the Filoni movie or a possible season 2. Though I won't deny I did have a lot of fun with this episode. The choreography was fantastic, displaying everyone's progression and personality effectively. The score behind this episode was excellent, the visuals were vibrant, especially within the space battle. Everyone seems guaranteed to make it out of this alive, but there is never a guarantee to this though, and if they are going to take anyone off the board, it would need to be justified at this point. Hayden returning for a follow-up appearance worked brilliantly, and honestly is something I'd love to see just once more, as maybe Ezra learning from him, or Ahsoka using his recordings for Sabine as a little callback to the Rebels episode Shroud of Darkness. Hera's little court sequence at the beginning was just basically a way to emasculate Xiono and give us a firm idea of how incompetent the New Republic really have become. Balin's journey is possibly my biggest concern right now, and one I don't have much faith will be dealt with effectively, but Filoni still has my vote on the writing team for Star Wars considering all the other jokers we have, and lest we forget we do need some closure regarding Shin, and the mystery of the witches wasn't really touched on here, but I pray that we'll get an answer to that next time as well, as we prepare to close the doors on Ahsoka as possibly one of the best Star Wars live action shows, though let's be real, that's not a very high bar to cross over.
It's funny because it's true.
Let's just cross our fingers that they leave us with a sense of catharsis here, while seeding the beginnings as something tantalising to return to later on in the greater Mandoverse. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you like this, hit the thumbs up below. Be sure to subscribe for more like this down the road, and to see my review for the final episode of Ahsoka next week. And until next time everyone, take care, and may the Force be with you.